Try to keep the awareness there when the mind wanders, then gently guide the breath. After a few minutes in silence, then I'll lead you in a short reflection on setting motivation. Now, to set our motivation for today, I want to do a short reflection with you first. And I want you to think back on your life and go back to kind of your earliest recollection of when you became aware of aging, of this concept of people progressing on aging, particularly around old age, but even just the concept of aging. And just think about your initial impressions of what aging was. And then maybe move into your childhood. What were your impressions at various points in your childhood of what aging was all about? Then move into your teenage years. What were your perceptions of aging at that time, or your attitudes towards those who had aged? And then examine the perspectives on aging you had through your adult life, all the way to now. What do you think of aging? What is the perception that you have? So then let's generate a motivation for being here to explore this reality of aging that has been going on for each of us throughout our lives and will carry on until our death. And if we can increase our awareness and desire to use aging as a platform through which we can develop greater awareness, greater spiritual practice, and generate that motivation for being here to explore that idea. How can I use the reality of aging to support me in my own progress towards achieving my true potential, my ability to become enlightened myself, and then to help others to do the same? It's the motivation we ideally want to bring to our time together. So it becomes very powerful. Just hold that awareness in your heart right now. So again, no doubt if you can get some reactions from people and just doing that reflection on aging, no doubt every one of you have different experiences in terms of aging and what it has meant for you throughout your life. The seeing, Cecilia, you may want to spotlight me. I'm not sure. I've got you on the screen here. I'm not sure if that. um, I see. Yeah, probably. So, I mean, for myself, when I think about kind of my own perceptions of aging, I go back to when I was first kind of introduced to my grandparents because my father was in the army. So we actually traveled around a lot. I was actually born in France, and then we were in Virginia, and then we were back over in Europe and Germany, and then we came back to the United States. So I was probably about, I don't know, 9, 10 years old before I met my grandparents in a way that I could remember them. And so I was introduced to kind of two sets of grandparents, my father's parents and my mother's parents. They both lived very close. My mother and father met each other in central Wisconsin. And I have like these two different contrasting views of grandparents in my life. My father's parents, it was like a very, all my memories are in black and white of them. It seemed, and I know, I mean, I wasn't, didn't have, I had the ability to see color. It wasn't the problem, but everything was very stark and kind of austere about my grandparents on my father's side. And I never really had with them, it seemed. Where my grandparents would be in the other room talking to my parents, and I'd be in a different room playing with my little brother or my sister. And that was it. That was my memory. My mother's parents, on the other hand, everything's in living color. All my memories are like of this very jubilant, wonderful household where my grandparents were very interested in us. My grandfather would sit me on his knee and talk to me, and there was this really warm feeling about it. So I had these kind of two contrasting views of like, well, is aging and getting to this place where you're a little bit more mature, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, what is it? Is it this solemn place of life, or is it a very joyful place of life? So we see that every one of us are shaped to some degree by our own experiences and what we have encountered in terms of aging. The Buddha says, of course, that aging begins once birth begins, and birth in Buddhism often goes even back to conception, but essentially, even once you come out of the womb, I mean, you're continually progressing, aging all the time. So we are going to be talking about aging in a very general way as the process that all of us go through, but moreover, looking at the whole idea of aging when it becomes more noticeable for many of us in the room. We've got a lot more gray hair, a lot more difficulty with our bodies, what have you. This is what happens to these bodies. This is something we have to kind of come to grips with and again, use on our spiritual path. But were there any insights anyone had in doing that reflection on your own sort of attitudes and perspectives on aging in your life? Anyone want to share anything? Yes,
I
Julie.
think when you're young, you want to get older
Yes.
because you want to learn how to ride a bike,
Yeah.
because you want to, be 21 so you can drink alcohol, or you want to be 16 so you can date and drive a car.
Yeah.
Right? You want to get older.
Right.
And then in college, I think you still want to get older. So then you go out into the world, and your 20s are a whirlwind. And then I think when you hit 30 or in your 30s, you start to realize that like you're an adult.
Yeah.
And that's okay. The 30s are okay. And then I think like by 40, then you start thinking, am I like in the middle of my life now? Or what is that? And then as you get older, I think that you're not trying to race time. You're trying to, really kind of, each day figure, you take more appreciation and time. You don't want to be 10 years old right now. 100 years old right now.
Don't even want to be 1 year older right now. No, Julia, thanks for sharing that. Because many of you probably saw Joni Mitchell singing at the Newport Folk Festival. Did you see it? If you haven't seen it, you have to see it. Earlier this summer, she came out at like 78, 79 years old. And she sang again at the Newport Folk Festival and in Rhode Island. And it was just amazing. She sang The Circle Game. Many of you know the song The Circle Game. And it's essentially, she wrote it when she was in her 20s. So it only goes up to about 20. But she's essentially talking about how in the beginning, we keep wanting the years to go by. We want to be older. We want to have our dreams fulfilled. We want to be able to get to that place. But then she says eventually you want to, she compares it to a merry-go-round that you're on that just keeps going around. And eventually you drag your feet to slow the circle down. You don't want it to go so quickly. Many of us are in that age phase of our life where we're kind of going, okay, can we slow it down for a bit? Because it does even have a name for this. I meant to look it up before coming here today. This phenomenon that occurs in our minds that makes it seem like time is getting quicker the older we get, that the days go by faster.
It's a mathematical thing.
Yeah.
When you've got 90% of your life left.
Yeah.
10 more times to go. But when you've only got, say, 10 years left, or 5 years out, then 90%. It's compressed. It is.
I'm reminded of Venerable Rabina, when many of you know Venerable Rabina, this amazing Australian dynamic teacher, one way to put it. She was talking to a friend of mine who had left Levi Strauss. I worked for Levi Strauss for a number of years before I found the Dharma, or before I left the work world to pursue Dharma more full time. But she was probably in her 50s, 55, something like that, when she left Levi Strauss, and she wasn't sure what she was going to do. And Lynn said, you better figure out what you're doing with your life. You're half dead already. But we don't really know when half dead is. I mean, that's the other thing we're going to touch on today, because obviously aging is relevant with respect to death. There's this milestone that we'll reach at that point where it's the end of the line. And so, what is half dead? What does it mean to be half dead? And when do we have that perspective? Yeah, please, Steve.
I've thought about this, and I think of it like an apple on the tree.
Yeah.
You watch the blossom come out, the apple grows, it's getting ripe, it gets ripe, and at one point in time, it goes past getting ripe, whatever that trend is.
Yeah.
And on the speed of aging, I just want to think about that. I mean, it is totally true. The older you get, it's like going faster. But I thought it's also interesting when you're very young, how slow it goes.
Right.
Like the time from 10 to 18 seemed like it took forever.
High school certainly seemed like forever to me. I mean, the thought of being reborn and having to go to high school again is already terrifying enough. But no, it's very true. But yeah, there is a name that psychologists have given to this like phenomenon that we have, that our minds seem to think that time goes quicker. But aging has a lot of implications. And those of you in the room who may be going, oh, I'm not sure I know what that's all about yet, because you're still quite young. This is why this talk is also good for you, is because it's important to recognize that when we become aware of the reality of aging, that it actually can be an impetus to examine our lives, because we don't know how long we have. That's a whole nother talk I could do on death and dying, and the reality of having some awareness around death. They say that, of course, there's the certainty of death, that every one of us will die without a doubt. But then, of course, the uncertainty of the time of death. And then we saw that during the pandemic, right? Because there were many people who were very, very young who succumbed to that virus and in very good health, dancers and athletes and all sorts of people who you would think wouldn't have that problem. But nonetheless, death came for them. So this is what we're going to be talking about today, and kind of using this whole concept of aging and as a way to help us to use it on our spiritual path, have that awareness that will be a greater impetus for us to make this life meaningful. Are there any other comments before I go to the slides? I don't want to shortchange anyone. Yeah, please, Graciela.
Well, I think that the awareness that the time is shorter now, it's like makes me think of appreciating today.
Yeah.
Just to
What's going on?
they have to get back online.
Probably their internet is not steady, so they lost us. But he'll see it in his computer.
Shoot. Let's see her.
See me changing? Okay.
Sorry about that, Don.
Okay, so sorry about that. Yeah, there's something going on with the computer, it's kicking me out of Zoom occasionally. So what do we mean by conscious aging? I know not everybody necessarily can see, so I'll read this. The process of utilizing the natural process of growing older as an opportunity for spiritual growth through cultivating wisdom and awareness, and thus a means to make all phases of our life fulfilling and meaningful. Kind of, I pulled that from a few things, but kind of put it together into this nice little package. This is what we're going to talk about today. Is how do I take an awareness of this? Now, we could, again, certainly do the same thing around the awareness of death or the awareness of illness being in our lives. These are some things we're going to touch on today as well, but we're going to focus on the idea of aging, growing older. All of us are at a point in our lives where we can certainly have that conscious awareness that this is going on and how we might be able to use it as a spiritual path. So this is the idea behind today's talk. I want to talk about it in terms of 3 steps. Now, one of the books that I'm going to cite is by Lewis Richmond called Aging as a Spiritual Practice. I think he goes into like 4 different stages, but I think I prefer to condense it to 3. The first step is becoming aware of the reality of aging. And I'm not talking about when we first became aware, like that first memory that I encourage you to think about when you became aware of the fact that there is aging, there is this phenomenon, people do get older and what have you. I'm kind of talking about it when it really hits home. which might be much later in life, even though we've been kind of dealing with aging throughout our lives. There's a place where things change a little bit. And then the second step is moving beyond that mere awareness to a fuller acceptance of the reality of aging, kind of inviting it in. And we've been touching on this theme throughout my teaching so far here of it's not like we're fighting against the suffering that we experience or the difficulties we experience. We're inviting them in and seeing what they have to teach us. You know, even our own kind of crazy minds, we can invite in some of the aspects of it and say, oh, here's my anger. What does my anger have to teach me? Here's my attachment. What does it have to teach me? Everything is a lesson. And we want to be able to use what we experience to kind of fully accept it. And then to, in the third step, going beyond that, to having genuine growth and appreciation of the reality of aging. This is what we'll talk about as well today is how does that become so that we actually are embracing our aging as a wonderful part of our being, and to acknowledge the phases of our life that will follow all of that and that give us different dimensions of ability to practice, things to practice with, what have you. Okay, so I'm going to take it off the share. Dare I do this? I don't know. It's kind of, it seemed fine. I'm still connected. Yeah. So, and by the way, if any of you in the Zoom room have any questions or comments, please just put your little hand icon up. It's down on the bottom there where it says reactions. And you just click on that, and then you should be able to put your hand up, and I'll be happy to attend to you if I can see it from my teaching and what have you. So again, I want to share the story of the Buddha's own life that gives, as Prince Siddhartha before he became the Buddha, that gives an understanding of how he was transformed by the reality of aging. And some of you know this story already, so bear with me as you hear it again. But Prince Siddhartha, when he was born, there were all these sorts of beautiful things about his birth, and that showed that this was a very special person. And his father, King Shuddhodana, saw all of this, and he was very worried that Prince Siddhartha would leave on some sort of spiritual quest. And so he wanted to keep the prince in the palace. So he did everything he could to contain him within the walls of the palace. And he made everything in the palace incredibly delightful and beautiful. All, people looking very youthful, and beautiful food and enjoyments and everything wonderful. Keep it all sort of fresh looking, so that the Prince Siddhartha would never get preoccupied by, things not being quite right, and therefore want to go on some sort of spiritual quest. Even been prophesied that this would be the Prince Siddhartha's future, that he would end up being a great spiritual leader. So one day there was a traveling sort of minstrel that came through and began to tell all these stories about the world outside the palace walls. And of course, the young prince was like, you're keeping something from me here. There's a whole world out there. I need to know what that world's about. And so the king decided, well, okay, I'll arrange for him to be able to go outside the palace walls. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to stage everything in these little towns that will take the Buddha to, or the prince to, so that everything will look like it's just at the palace. There won't be any difference. So he'll become disenchanted with the idea of going out and finding anything else. And he'll just see a mirror of what his life is like right now. So they take him, his charioteer takes him off to this one town that they've set up like this, and everything looks beautiful and wonderful, except somehow he sees a sick person who's ravaged by illness. And he goes, oh my gosh, what is this? Kind of the shock of seeing someone who's unwell after seeing only beautiful, well, vibrant people all of his life. And his charioteer says, oh, this is illness. And he says, illness, this looks really horrific. He says, is this going to happen to me? And he says, yes, this happens to all of us. So the prince is like, knocked out by this. He goes back to the palace and he says, I've got to find out more about the world outside these walls, what it's really like. So the king, of course, tries to arrange it again so that everything is wonderful and delightful. The charioteer takes him to that town. And even though the king made this great effort, the prince still sees someone who is aged, who's decrepit, dealing with the ravages of the body due to aging. And the Buddha is, I keep saying the Buddha, it's no difference really, Prince Siddhartha and the Buddha, but the prince sees this aging person and says, what is this? And his charioteer says, I think Chana was his name. Chana says, oh, this is aging. And the Buddha says, is this going to happen to me? He says, of course, this happens to all of us. And of course, he's freaked out now. And he goes back to the palace and he's like, this is too unsettling. He goes out a third time, and even though the king staged everything again, the prince still sees this time a corpse being taken through town, the funeral, to take it to the river to burn the corpse. He's just like totally, taken by this lifeless body. He's never seen this before. And of course, he asks Chana, he says, what is this? This is death. And he says, Chana, does it happen? Is this going to happen to me? And he says, yes, this happens to everyone. We all do. So the Buddha was just like, blown away now. He's just totally distressed. And that's indicative, again, of what happens when we begin to have this moment of not just the awareness that there's aging or these various things, but that they are going to happen to us and we have to face that reality. Of course, this is what led the Buddha to his fourth journey outside the palace walls as Prince Siddhartha. And he, this time, saw a mendicant, one of these spiritual aspirants who was trying to find a way out of all of this. Had come to that realization already and was on a spiritual quest. And of course, the prince says, that's what I need to do. So even though the king had tried very hard to keep him contained within the palace walls, he ended up leaving at the age of 29, I think was the age he left the palace. And for 6 years, he was on his spiritual quest. And eventually, as you know, achieved enlightenment under what's known as the Bodhi tree in India. So the story kind of tells us that there are these realities that we do need to be aware of and attentive to that are important for us to get on the spiritual path and to increase our enthusiasm for a spiritual path. So I'm going to share these in terms of the context. We'll see how we do with the share screen now. See if I can make it work. Okay, hopefully you're seeing that screen at home. The first step, the Buddha's experience with aging, I just talked about as Prince Siddhartha.
Make sure they're still
I think so. Yeah, I see them in the little boxes. Yeah, they're in the little boxes next door here. And then my own experience with aging, I kind of touched on that already. I mean, I could certainly say more things about it. One thing I might mention that you all know that I've got gray hair, but I actually had some gray hair in high school. Began like with just some gray on the sides here. But by the time I went to the master's program, I went there when I was 39. I had my 40th birthday the first year at the master's program in Italy. And there were 2 women from Asia, one from Japan and one from Singapore. And they both thought I was 25. I told them it was my 40th birthday. And you got to be crazy. How can I be 25? I mean, wake up. But then it was weird. 7 years later, when I got out of the master's program and I'm living in Santa Fe, and I went to one of the local groceries, it was called Wild Oats. They ended up getting bought out by Whole Foods. But I go in there and it's their Tuesday senior day, and they gave me the discount. And I'm like 47. I'm like, hey, folks, it starts at 62. So I've had this weird thing around my own aging, like, how old am I really? These women think I'm 25, but then 7 years later, they think I'm 62. So I don't know. But the master's program aged me. It is interesting to see how presidents age, right? We just saw Barack Obama getting the formal painting that's going to be there in the White House or whatever. And my gosh, he looks so much older now. Anyway, but yeah, we do learn from these experiences that we have in our own lives about what aging is and how old we are. What's interesting about aging is that our bodies are continually aging, but our minds aren't aging, right? There's no aging process there. There's a continual process in terms of what's going on with our response to the aging of the body. But we don't feel like we're that much different than other times of our life. Mentally, at least I don't. Maybe all of you do, but I think it's kind of an interesting perspective that we have because the mind doesn't really age. Mind is not a physical phenomenon. It's not subject to aging in that way. It changes. It's impermanent. So this gets into aging as a part of the nature of reality. That there is this phenomenon called aging that we have to contend with. A book that I'm going to cite here as well is a book by Larry Rosenberg. He's a teacher for the Insight Meditation Society, not our organization. But he wrote a wonderful book called Living in the Light of Death. I frequently use it when I talk about death, but it's equally relevant in talking about aging. He summarizes this in terms of 5 contemplations that the Buddha advised us to reflect on frequently. And these are the first 3 that mirror exactly what the Buddha saw as Prince Siddhartha when he went out to these towns, right? I am subject to aging. Aging is unavoidable. I am subject to illness. Illness is unavoidable. I am subject to death. Death is unavoidable. And again, we have to get that at a very deep level of understanding with our deepest awareness. This is our reality. This is what we are caught up in. If you don't want to, age, be ill, and die, then you don't get born. And the only way you're not going to get born is by getting free of the cycle of rebirth. And that's what we'll touch on in a little bit. But essentially, these three, I think, again, we can develop some initial awareness of, but we want to increase our awareness of them so that we actually live from a place where we understand those to be our own reality. The last 2 points are kind of interesting. The fourth one even touches on what we did in our work yesterday around grief. I will grow different, separate from all that is dear and appealing to me. Of course, if we live that long, some people don't live long enough to experience that reality of, losing things and having, no longer being involved with the things that are dear and appealing to us, what have you. But this is part of our reality too. And I know my mom, she's lost so many of her friends, and she's the oldest of her siblings that is still around and managed to kind of hold on. She's 92 years old. But, she's let go of an awful lot throughout that time. And if we live long enough, we will see, lots of lamentation, lots of grief, many tears as we go through a process of separating from everything that is dear to us. The fifth one is a particular contemplation around karma, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today. Maybe not as much as I would generally. I am the owner of my actions, my karma, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, and live dependent on my actions. Whatever I do for good or for ill, to that will I fall heir. Of course, this is kind of to put all of those other points in a perspective, in that everything we do in response to those realities of our aging, our illness, our death, our grief and loss that we will have to experience. When we look at those things and understand that our responses to those will dictate how we experience the future. That's the essential principle of karma. Karma is generally referred to as the law of cause and effect. We have great confidence in the physical law of cause and effect in our world. Otherwise, we wouldn't go about planting gardens to get vegetables or doing whatever it is to create various results in our lives, right? We understand that you put certain causes into place and you get certain results from those causes. So in the physical world, we have great confidence in this. But when it comes to karma as the operative element in terms of our experience, we need to be aware of this reality and to really work with it and understand it, because it is shaping what we are experiencing and what we will experience. The Buddha says that essentially everything we experience, this moment right now, everything that you know in this life is a product of your own past actions. If you have good, wonderful things in your life, you have good health, have beautiful people around you that you enjoy the time with and what have you, those are all products of your own good karma of the past. The good intentions and actions that have followed from that you've been engaged in. If you have unfortunate things happening, those are the product of those times that we haven't been so skillful in our actions. And it's just a simple explanation. It's not a justification. It's not reward and punishment. It's simply an understanding that what we do has an impact on what we experience. What we're experiencing now is a reflection of what we've done in the past. What we do now will give rise to our future experiences. So this is the principle that's being spoken to here. So we're owner of our actions, owner of our karma. We don't create karma and then give it to someone else. It stays with you, and it plays out in this life, and it plays out in future lives, just as it's played out in past lives. And we are heir to our actions. Everything that we have done in the past, we are heir to in the moment. We're born of our actions. We are, go through the process of rebirth through the force of our karma. One of the main results of karma is that you will continue to take rebirth as long as we create that karma. And by karma here, we mean a karma that is together with these deluded states of mind. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail today, but this is the real core of the Buddhist teachings. We have to address these deluded states of mind, and even particularly address the root of ignorance that we have that's driving the whole show. So this is what we have. We are related through our actions, live dependent on our actions. Everything revolves around karma. In fact, one teacher in our tradition, Venerable Dundrup, this is in the module on karma that we have in Discovering Buddhism. They did like a 25-minute video for each of these modules. And in this module, he says, when he thinks about it, he actually thinks that this is probably the most important teaching of the Buddha. You might say, well, Buddha's teaching on compassion, really nice, really like it. It's great that we can have that. Teachings on emptiness, even. Well, that's really wonderful. It gives us the key out of here. But the teachings on karma explain the whole mechanism by which we are involved in what we call samsara, which is our unenlightened experience, and in particular, our experience of going, cycling from life to life. It's often referred to as cyclic existence. And then our experience of nirvana, which is the absolute peace we can attain on the basis of freeing ourselves from that cycle. So all of it is contingent upon karma. It's contingent upon creating the causes through our own minds and our actions that follow from that. Being able to affect a different result, as opposed to the result that we've been having since beginningless time. And that's a concept that I think Westerners have a hard time dealing with, is the concept that we've been around since beginningless time. The view of science was deeply rooted in a materialistic view that kind of beings are born and they live out their life and then they cease and that's it. And then, of course, spirituality in many traditions has incorporated the concept of a soul, something that is a part of us that goes beyond this to an afterlife. But in Buddhism, there's simply the idea of a thread of consciousness that goes through all of these existences. And consciousness is always arising from a previous moment of consciousness. So there's never an initial point of consciousness. Instead, everything is going back without any beginning, and our consciousness will go forward without any end. But what that consciousness will be kind of working with, and the existences it will be in are dependent upon our own karma. And of course, if we want to attain a state where our minds are completely free of all the craziness and delusion, well, then we'll experience that, but on the basis of our own actions. So this is the Buddhist view of things. And so this is placed in here because obviously when we begin to become aware of the reality of those things, aging and illness and death and so on, it becomes a great impetus for us to pay attention to our actions. As Graciela was saying, to make sure that we use every day with great gratitude for having that day as an opportunity to practice. So this is that initial point of like becoming aware of all of this. This is a reflection that we can certainly engage in continually. In fact, as he says, we should probably reflect on this daily, that these are realities for us. I want to share a little bit about what Larry Rosenberg shares on this in his book. I think it's kind of very true. This isn't the cheeriest set of reflections in the world. And most people, when they first hear them, feel some resistance. I remember when I first came to Buddhism, it was kind of hard to get my head around some of these concepts and really embrace them. They don't mind contemplating the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence in the world around them, but this is getting a little close to home. All of this is rooted within that idea of impermanence. We spoke about this a little bit yesterday. Impermanence is the reality that everything changes. In fact, not Larry Rosenberg, Louis Richmond, the other author that I'm going to quote here and there, I'll take it off screen for just a moment. He said that he studied with Suzuki Roshi, the great Zen master. And there was one talk where Suzuki Roshi was saying all these Buddhist concepts to this audience. There was one person in the room who kind of put their hand up and said, I hear what you're saying, Roshi, about all these Buddhist things, but can you tell me one thing that I can understand? And Suzuki Roshi, after the laughter died down, he simply said two words, everything changes. And it's a hard thing for us to get at some point, because even though we might have that intellectual understanding of impermanence, and we might have faced the reality of impermanence in a variety of ways, we still tend to cling to the opposite. We still tend to think that we're going to be able to get things to a place where they're unchanging. This is, of course, what drives people to be very focused on the external in their lives, which is, of course, something that with an awareness of aging, we can alter and actually focus on the internal work. But most people live their lives totally focused on how do I make the external world into something that I can rely upon and be certain about, right? If I get the perfect partner and the perfect job and the perfect car and the perfect home and the perfect pet and the perfect this and the perfect that, it'll all come together to be like a perfect picture that I can just live happily ever after, right? We know that from fairy tales when we grew up, right? And they lived happily ever after. That's the kind of view that we have, but we're going to be able to somehow make that work. Well, the first problem is how do you even get all those perfect things in place, right? It's a bit like whack-a-mole. You get some in place and then one falls away and you have to kind of address that, and then the other one falls away and you have to go there. Most people don't get them all in place. And even if you have the good fortune of getting them all in place, maybe there are some people who have like that idyllic life, the rich and famous, whatever, that, feel like they're living the high life. It doesn't last, and it doesn't really provide any lasting satisfaction. mean, look at the incidence of mental illness among people who are very well off. You haven't worked on the fundamental problem, which is you cannot possibly find satisfaction in those external things. They don't provide that. Temporarily, sure. Nice to have a beautiful home. Nice to have, wonderful kids and beautiful people in your life. But they're not the solution to the problem because you're not really understanding the complete problem. Of course, that goes into the way that the Buddha taught what our fundamental situation is. It's through the force of our karma and our delusions that are driving it that we continue on that cycle of existence, continue to experience what he called dukkha, this unsatisfactory existence. And of course, one of the elements of dukkha is impermanence, that everything's constantly changing and therefore not providing the lasting satisfaction and peace that we desire. Look at this body, again, the changing relationship, as Julia was saying, with our own sense of self and how we wanted to get older at various points in our life. And then the body starts aging and we go, whoa, 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 slow down. I don't want to get old. So there's this inevitable reality that we have to deal with, of things constantly changing. So sort of that beginning of the understanding of all of that and embracing of the reality of impermanence and of course aging, that is the most evident form of impermanence that we have to deal with, perhaps. So, whoops. And so Larry Rosenberg continues. He says, what is being asked of us as meditators is to come face to face with the law of impermanence in an intimate way. That's what today is kind of about, is looking at particularly the topic of aging and becoming intimate with that reality. Whether you consider yourself young or whether you consider yourself middle-aged or whether you consider yourself maybe a little older aged or old aged. By the way, on this, I might mention a story about my mom. My father passed away and when they were 70, they were the same age. They met in high school, I think. And at 78, 79, she decided she was going to take one of these trips with buses full of senior citizens, And so she went up to because she lives in Indianapolis. I think they went up to Vermont on this bus trip and they had, a couple of nights up there in the fall to see the beautiful foliage. And she came back from the trip and I called her and I said, so Mom, how was your trip? And she says, that's the last time I get on a bus with a bunch of old people. She was 78, 79. And we're like, Mom, are you not an old person? But, that's relative. We always keep looking at someone else as being the old person. Now my mom, I don't know if she's denying it at 92, but So whenever we become aware of this reality, we need to embrace this reality. As meditators, we need to come face to face with that. As you look at old faces, as you look at other people in the room who have a lot more gray hair than you, think that'll be me. Venerable Robina, another story about her, talking about death, not aging. We had one of our members who passed away, and I remember writing the email to her saying, oh, Vivian has passed away, just so you know, and if you can do prayers for her. And she sent me an email back really quickly. She says, every time I hear this sort of news, I think someday that'll be me. That's what we should think. That'll be me. At some point, there's going to be an email going around about, oh, did you hear so-and-so died? That will happen to you. Of course, you won't be there. You'll have passed away, but that is the reality. We're going to be an email to all of our friends saying, did you hear that, so-and-so died? Right?
Maybe just a text.
Maybe just a text.
Or tweet.
I know I'm dated in my email. At least I didn't say a letter. I tend not to text so much. I'm just dragging my feet on technology. But so I like this little quote from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Many of you have heard of him, a bit of a crazy teacher, Pema Chodron's teacher, who's an amazing current modern day teacher. He said, in the garden of gentle sanity, may you be bombarded by coconuts of wakefulness. I have this vision of while you're doing your meditation of something hitting you on the head and just going, wow, I got to wake up to that, And this is what we're trying to do with this understanding at this first stage. This first step is to really get this idea that this is a reality for us. One way to look at this is, as the author Lewis Richmond says, he describes it with this term lightning strikes. And he says one way to describe this experience of awakening to the reality of aging is set out by him in Aging as a Spiritual Practice, where he calls it lightning strikes. And he tells a story about his father to illustrate this. Rather than reading the whole story, I'm just going to kind of share it offline. The story has to do with, many of you have heard of Robert Graves. He was a great scholar of Greek and Roman mythology and what have you. And there was a book by Robert Graves that his father brought into him. And of course, Lewis Richmond was a bit younger at this time, and his father's got this book. And on the front cover was a young picture of Robert Graves. And on the other side was a picture of him now, like the little with the bio about him, whatever. And he goes, and his father was like showing him this book, and he's saying, "Look at this." And he'd like turn the book, and his father was just like awakening to this reality of like, that was the young person and this is the old person. I mean, try that yourself. Go home and look at a picture of you from 30 years ago, if you lived that long, or 20 years ago, or whenever. And, just see the reality of how different you look from then to now. Then he talks about his own experience, Lewis Richmond, about how he woke up to the reality of his aging. And it came through illness, actually, through facing some heart problems and difficulties that caused him to really reevaluate his whole life. I like Larry Rosenberg's story. He said that for him, it was this experience at 63. He was on a bus one day. There was a very crowded bus in Boston, I think. And he's, standing because everybody else had already gotten on the bus and gotten all the seats. And somebody stands up to give him his seat. And he's like, no, that's what I do for other people. He was always the one who would be happy to give up his seat to an elderly person. And here someone's giving it to him. And he's like, oh, I can't have this perception of myself as youthful anymore because I'm not. Other people see me in a very different light. And we always see ourselves a little different, again, than what others see us. So again, there's a lightning strikes moment, and maybe some of you can even identify a point in your life where you kind of get the penny dropped. You got it at a much deeper level of like, wow, this is a reality for me. I'm aging. I'm dealing with that and the consequences of it. Does anyone want to share anything in that regard?
The first time somebody calls you sir.
Sir. Yeah. Sir and ma'am. Yeah, you get that kind of like, whoa, what's that about? And it definitely is that idea.
Or they call you Mr. Merrick. I'm like, no, that's my father.
Right.
Steven.
Yeah. Jack, you were gonna say.
Seems like every year I get a new health surprise these days.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's something new.
Right.
It's not working.
Some part of the body is
Yeah.
the blinking warning
I'm
light,
always wondering what's
flashing.
gonna be next year.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Your story about the bus is really interesting because I think it brings up the fact that you can age physically and we still be significantly useful.
Yes.
As long as we want, and we can still play and have fun.
Yeah.
No matter what age we are. So I think that's
Yeah.
like
No, and I get,
thing to think about.
yeah. What's your name?
My name is Matt.
Hi, Matt. Yeah. No, and I think what Matt's bringing up is one kind of a nice point. I mean, it's not to say that we should feel older necessarily, that we want to keep a youthful sort of attitude towards our minds. And I think there's some benefit to that, certainly. I mean, we've seen people who sort of feel like they're declining, that the body then tends to decline even more quickly. But it's to have the awareness while we're still having that youthful attitude. But you're right, there can be a disconnect between how we see ourselves and how others might be perceiving us. Yeah, Anthony, you were going to share something.
I'm at that 30 mark that we're getting grown up, and it's interesting. I don't think I've had my lightning strike moment yet, but
Yeah.
I'll watch TV or a sporting event. That's a good example. A game, and you see the athletes, and at some point I became older than all of them. For most of the time I was their age or younger, right? I grew up watching.
Yeah.
So that's interesting now to turn on game, and the majority of athletes you see on TV are younger.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at. I'm not at the bus yet. No one's offered me a seat.
Yeah. But again, we can have this at perhaps even an early age without those sorts of experiences. I mean, and some people do have health problems, unfortunately, at an early age, and they begin to look at that reality much quicker. I mean, I'll tell you one that happened for me about 7 years ago. It was my mother's 85th birthday. And instead of celebrating her birthday as we had intended to do, we were going to maybe get together, have a nice gathering. There was a family reunion, and we said, well, let's take her up to the family reunion. It was a month or two after her birthday, but we thought this would be a nice thing for her to be able to be with her relatives and us to be with our cousins that we hadn't seen in many, many years. That family reunion was an eye-opener because I had not spent much time around my cousins since they were very small. And of course, they're all fully grown up and they have kids, and some of their kids have kids. And you're like going, oh my gosh, what happened here? And my mother, of course, was there as the matriarch in a sense, because my grandparents, those wonderful living in color or living color grandparents, they're gone, passed away many years ago. But they're the the older ones, and we're right behind them. I kind of envision this sort of, they're the ones that are going to have to fall off the plank into the ocean first, but we're right behind them, being pushed by all the people behind us, and we're going to have to fall off at some point. So it kind of hit me at that, to see that I'm one of the older people now, and it's all these kids running around that I used to be that. I used to be that kind of having joy and fun with my cousins and what have you. So I think, sometimes it's gradual, but sometimes it can be an earth-shaking moment where we go, wow, this is happening to me and I need to be attentive to this. Okay. So I might share just a little bit more of what Lewis Richmond says. It's a wonderful book, by the way. I might mention while we're on the subject of him that he's written a new book that he has written specifically for men. I'm glad to see so many men here today because men traditionally have a much harder time confronting aging than women do. And it's just something in society, perhaps not for everybody. I'm not saying this is across the board, but in our culture, we do tend to have a lot of resistance around looking at the issues that come up around aging. He wrote a book called Every Breath, New Chances that goes into more discussion about men and the issues that they deal with in our society in confronting aging. So this is how he describes this lightning strikes. He says, it's the moment we truly wake up to our aging and can see the full significance of it in our whole life, from its unremembered beginning to its unknown end. Until that moment, regardless of our age, we spend much of the time not thinking too much about where our life is headed or what it all means. So again, we might have that at an earlier time. Certainly, I found my spiritual path much previous to the family reunion. I mean, we might have moments where we begin to wake up to the reality of what life is all about and seek some deeper meaning and purpose. But nonetheless, there's kind of individual moments that we might have around various factors of life that we perhaps were a bit blind to prior to that. And he says, but once lightning strikes, it's different. We reach a tipping point. We have stopped seeing things as we wished they were, and for a moment at least, can see them as they actually are. This is really one of the most wonderful things I found about the Buddhist teachings when I found this path, was that it was speaking truth to me, and not truth that I needed to like go through all sorts of, kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but like some sort of confusing, ridiculous process to get to. It's instead something I can actually analyze and look at and see the reality of. The Buddha wasn't teaching things that were, some things, obviously, emptiness, very profound concept, take a little while to realize, but we're using our rational minds to do this. We're using our reasoning brains that can actually kind of examine, what things are and come to some understanding of them for ourselves. So those 5 contemplations that I mentioned, they can be discerned pretty easily. The last one on karma, I can't prove karma to you. I can't absolutely say, well, the reason why you're experiencing this in your life is because you did this in a prior life. They say that enlightened beings have that awareness because they have an omniscient mind that understands all of what exists. But nonetheless, we can use it as a working hypothesis and live our lives and see if we get different results when we're attentive to what we think, what we say, what we do. So even karma has some level of kind of grounding in, experience and actually working with it. All the Buddhist teachings are really about seeing things as they actually are, really coming to understand what we are involved in. I kind of joked when I was in the master's program with our teaching assistant. I said, it seems to me like some people might look at Buddhists and think, God, you people just aren't satisfied with the way things are. Because most of the world is quite content with it. They'll have the reality of aging and death and all these things around them, but they just keep living their lives being fascinated by all the pleasures of samsara, all the wonderful things. And, when you come to see them for what they are, they lose their luster to some degree. But it's not that you don't have anything, then you have the spiritual path that becomes this amazing jewel that you can treasure and use in your life. So it's kind of the idea behind that. Maybe that's enough on the first step. I kind of only worked with that so far. The second step is moving beyond mere awareness to a fuller acceptance of the reality of aging. Once we kind of get that idea that it's happening, maybe even have our lightning strikes moment, we still need to get to a place where we kind of accept it as something that becomes this portal again, this opportunity for us to do something different with our lives. certainly many people come to that awareness of their aging and death, but maybe they get quite depressed after that and decide they really can't engage fully in life any longer because it's too dismal to look at the reality of what aging has in store for them. So this fuller or deeper acceptance, I want to give just a little teaching that precedes what I'm going to talk about here. There's a couple of key concepts that we don't really get into as much in Tibetan Buddhism, but I saw them in these other teachings from the Pali tradition, and I think they're really useful. But one of the sutras that they use in the Pali tradition is what's called the Salata Sutra, the Arrow Sutra. What the Buddha says in this teaching is that we have two arrows that are involved in our suffering. Some people even point out a third one. I'll mention that in a moment. The first arrow is the undeniable arrow, the arrow that we're going to experience based on being born into this world and having karma that causes us to have certain experiences. The first arrow is aging in this case. Aging is going to happen to you. It's a reality. It's an arrow, meaning that it's going to pierce us, cause us some suffering, some difficulty. But it's something we can't do much about, at least in our current situation. The Buddha did say there's a way to relieve ourselves of even the first arrow. That's the whole path to liberation that he taught, where you can remove the causes of us being in this conditioned existence. And obviously, that's the larger thing that we want to be aiming for, is to remove ourselves from that. But again, in this tradition, to moreover remove all beings from that. But the first arrow is not something we generally can do much about in the moment. You're going to be pierced by first arrows throughout your life. Right, we're going to have the arrow of grief at losing someone we love, or a pet that we held very dear, or just the day-to-day. We talked yesterday about micro griefs, the fact that we have losses and changes in our lives throughout every moment of the day. We have to let go of things constantly. You're going to have pain and suffering in your life, mentally, physically. That's the first arrow. The second arrow is the arrow that we take and we pierce ourselves with on the basis of all of our thoughts about the first arrow. This is what the Buddha's expertise is in kind of addressing. How are you relating to the first arrow? Are you accepting the first arrow? But moreover, what is your relationship to that first arrow in terms of being able to use it in a much more profound way, rather than creating the habitual tendencies that we've fed into and bought into throughout our lives and throughout beginningless lives? Usually after the first arrow, we do all kinds of crazy stuff, right? We go, why did this happen to me? And why didn't it happen to somebody else? And I didn't deserve this. And this is horrible. Can you, and we try to get pity from other people. And we do all sorts of things that create a whole story around the first arrow. When all that has happened is we've been hit by something that is a natural experience, something that is a ripening of our own karma. And that's all that it is. That's all it needs to be. It's just simply a moment of suffering, and we move on, or we do something even more positive with it. But instead, we get into this whole concept of feeding a narrative that is totally of our own creation. And that causes us even more pain. Or let's say the pain that happens when somebody says something really rude to you. Maybe it's a friend that you've had for many years, and suddenly they become like this really acerbic person and just, say something really horrible to you. And you just go, wow, where did that come from? I didn't deserve that. I've treated them so well. And you keep ruminating and creating more and more anger towards that person. I often use the analogy, it's a different one than the arrow, that holding on to those sorts of thoughts is like holding on to a hot coal, waiting to throw it at the person to get back at them. And you're getting burned in the meantime. We keep kind of piercing ourselves with that arrow, holding on to that hot coal, doing whatever we can to kind of further those sorts of thoughts. And we cause our own suffering. And the other person, maybe they said that and they went on and they're kind of living their own lives, happily doing whatever. And we allow them to keep living in our minds and creating this turmoil. That's all of our own creation. That's the second arrow. They say the third arrow, those people who add a third arrow to it, which wasn't in the Buddha's sutta, but nonetheless, the third arrow is when we then go do something on the basis of those thoughts. Then we go back to that person and we do something really mean to them. Maybe we go there at night and key their car, or maybe we, say something mean on Facebook about them so that all their friends see how horrible they were to us. And that's where we create an additional karma, additional action. That's not just our thoughts about that person and that incident. It's creating an actual tangible thing that will ripen into something that we have to experience in the future. And it's caused harm to others. And in the process, we've, done, all of that damage. So know that this This is something we have control over. And why I'm highlighting in this, I like to teach on this. It's not taught in the Tibetan tradition so much, but it gives us an understanding that we actually have control over certain things. First arrow stuff, not as much. As I said, there's a deeper way to get rid of the first arrows. But second arrow stuff is totally in your court. Do with it what you will, but it makes more sense to not let that second arrow stuff continue on and boil up and boil over, because it's not helpful. It's only you causing yourself pain. And certainly don't do the third arrow stuff. Even if you happen to sit in your own room ruminating over something somebody did to you, don't take revenge on them. Don't throw the coal at them. Don't do whatever it is that will harm them, because you're creating another level of damage, again, to both them and to yourself. This gets into the idea that we have to begin to have more control over our thoughts about these subjects. Aging is the first arrow. What are our thoughts about aging? What are the resistance we have to our own aging? Not embracing our own aging fully, as seeing what it has to show us, what it can teach us. That's, again, maybe the second arrow that we have often with aging. We have a lot of denial. Of course, our society does a lot to help people deny their aging, right? All the Botox treatments and the various skin creams and things that you can do to make yourself continue to look youthful, in quotes. I say in quotes because sometimes people don't necessarily look that youthful. But, we keep embracing that concept of like, how do we make ourselves somewhat immortal, even though we know death is down the line? So there are kind of, when we begin to feed into those sorts of thoughts and really start to work with, the thoughts that are more beneficial rather than those more dangerous and detrimental thoughts, then we begin to get to a place where we actually can channel some of our acceptance of aging into the spiritual path. This is where I'm going to share these two concepts that I think it was Larry Rosenberg who talks about these. Again, I don't hear similar concepts, but I'm going to relate them to a concept that we use pretty frequently in Tibetan Buddhism. These are words from the Pali Samvega. In Pali, by the way, those of you who don't know, Pali was sort of the initial language that the Buddha's teachings were written down in. The initial sutras, discourses of the Buddha were written in the Pali language, and that was the first sort of wave of Buddhism. What we practice in the Mahayana are mostly in the Sanskrit language, the Sanskrit sutras. But in Pali, this phenomenon is known as samvega, the urgent need to practice that can grow out of heightened sense of the perishable nature of life. It can include a real feeling of shock and a sense that not only that life doesn't last forever, but also that the way we have been living is wrong. So this goes beyond kind of that first stage. At that first stage when lightning strikes, if this happens to people who don't have a spiritual path, it can be really distressing, right? They might, again, go into some deep depression, coming to the awareness of their own aging and their own mortality. Whereas this is saying, not only doesn't life last forever, but we've been living it wrong. We've been doing the wrong things, and we need to be really attentive to what we're doing from here on out, because aging will happen. I often, these days, at my age, I really kind of try to encourage people who are on the younger side of life to really take advantage of your youth for spiritual practice. A lot of us have that idea that when we get old, we're going to go on retreat. We're going to have much more time when we're retired and what have you. You don't necessarily have the energy to do all these things. And even if you have the time, you might not have the money, or you might not have everything falling into place. Take advantage of what you have now. And I know many people have very busy jobs and work life and what have you. But when you have opportunity, as much as possible, try to engage in retreat, more wholehearted spiritual practice. Make your life more meaningful now, and it will pay off. Actually, another quote from Suzuki Roshi that he told Louis Richmond was that, somebody asked, why do we meditate? And Suzuki Roshi says, so we can enjoy getting older. And in some way, this is true. If we have that to our lives, if we have that aspect of our, meditation practice, our spiritual practice, then we will enjoy our older age. We will have the opportunity to really make something meaningful out of it. Continuing with this concept of samvega, he says it might turn our world upside down, sending us off to a whole new way of life. Even if it doesn't have so dramatic an effect, it can light a fire under our practice. We get much less caught up in power, prestige, money, lust, the acquisition of goods. Of course, sometimes that happens naturally to people as they get older, right? Aging does have that ability to kind of forces to some degree to withdraw from the preoccupations of society. I mean, certainly when people let go of their career and their jobs, if they do that in their retirement, then they kind of have to say goodbye to that dimension of their experience, and aren't so concerned about how they appear to others and their performance at work and all these other things that we are preoccupied with when we're much younger. But even if you have that sort of moment that it forces you to look at life more seriously at a younger age, then you won't get as caught up in those things. Why? Because they don't matter so much. I mean, for me, I have to admit that probably most of my sorts of awarenesses around these things came when I confronted the issue of mortality, when my partner died at my age of 35 in 1992. In dealing with the loss of someone in my life, where at 34, I didn't really think that that was going to be a reality for me, that I was going to be saying goodbye to the person I loved in my life. And that caused me to go on my spiritual path. That caused me to find Tibetan Buddhism and to go off to Italy and study 7 years, and to leave my career as an accountant and finance person at Levi Strauss and to become a Buddhist teacher. So I have to admit that my wasn't as much around aging as it was around death and dying. But this concept of Samvega can happen in regard to anything, where we actually get it. We go, this is a turning point for me. I'm not going to continue doing what I've been doing. I'm going to have to do something else. And that can come because of our acceptance of aging, our acceptance of death, our acceptance of illness, and all the other forms of suffering that are a part of life. All right. There's another kind of related concept to this. We'll get to this in just a moment. Let me finish off Samvega. He says here, Dharma teachings start to make real sense to us at that time, and we begin to live them instead of just assenting intellectually. I think this is an important point. I mean, I teach many people in the progress of going around to various centers, even online these days and what have you. It's important not just to be focused on getting the teachings and hearing the teachings and having a wonderful experience of sitting in a room like this and enjoying the teachings with others. You really have to practice them. You really have to take them home. Frequently at the end of teachings, I'll encourage people to think of one thing that you learned from today that you'd like to put into effect in your life, or you'd like to think about more frequently or be focused on. And it's good to always have that perspective. Many teachings like today, you'll get many different concepts, right? Many different things that invite thoughts. And it's hard to kind of take it all in. But take just one thing away from each teaching. And at this point, when you have this sort of awakening up to that reality, it's important to investigate them more deeply. Actually spend some time meditating and thinking about them. So Samvega leads to a conversion of the heart from an egocentric existence to a search for that which is timeless, vast, and sacred. Related to this is pasada, which again is not a term we use in Tibetan Buddhism at all. It's an important accompaniment to Samvega, this Pali concept of pasada, which might be translated as clear and serene confidence, a conviction that our situation isn't hopeless, that the practice of meditation can take us beyond sickness, aging, and death. If we look at the Buddha's life, kind of these were the two sort of points he had of like the first three visions he saw right when he was in the towns, and he was seeing the reality of suffering. He had his Samvega moment, He was like, oh my God, this is reality. I'm not living my life the right way, because I should be deeply concerned that this is a reality for every single being, myself included. And then he had the fourth vision of the mendicant. And he said, it's not hopeless. There's the spiritual path. There's somebody who is engaging in this search for meaning and a search for a way out of all of this. So again, we get kind of both sides to it. In Tibetan Buddhism, we might incorporate both of these into the concept of renunciation. Neither one is an exact match for what we call renunciation. Renunciation, it's a weird English word. I don't really like it. It's not the perfect meaning, but it's the kind of coming to the conclusion that we don't want to be involved in what we've been involved in the past, samsara, continuing to go from life to life under the control of these factors. And we want to strive to be liberated from them. It's kind of gotten both sides to it, and we have some confidence, obviously, in that path of liberation. But this is kind of encapsulates it into kind of two different ideas. The distress that comes when we see that things are what they are, and then the confidence that there's a way out of this, that there's something we can actually do. Continuing with Masada, he says, the problem surrounding these phenomena is not external to us. It has everything to do with our cravings and attachments. Suffering is not a dead end, but a gateway to realization. I mentioned that yesterday. We actually have to embrace our suffering as part of the path, like the mud that the lotus grows from. the proper application of the practice of what they use in the Pali tradition of the Eightfold Path. In our tradition, we tend to focus on a way of looking at the path to enlightenment and so on. That can turn the pain of sickness and death into the joy of liberation. So it's not hopeless, folks, you know. When we begin to look at all of this and we get the reality of aging in our face and death in our face, it's not to just make you depressed. You know, in the very first teaching that the Buddha gave, he taught in the first two truths our situation, the truth of dukkha that I mentioned, this dissatisfactory, unsatisfactory state we're in, and the causes of that, our karma and delusion. And if he stopped there, it'd be a really dismal view, right? He'd be like, why did you tell me this? You know, why did you tell me I'm in an unsatisfactory state and I'm causing it through my own mind and my karma? You know, if I can't do anything about it, what's the point? I'll just enjoy life instead. But he went on in the last two truths to say there can be an end to that. And let me tell you how, the path that leads to that. So the Four Noble Truths are a wonderful beginning point. They were the first teaching the Buddha gave to really get a structure around what the Buddha's teaching and to give us the confidence that there is a way out of this. Because the delusions and our ignorance that are in our minds that are causing all of this are not hardwired. They're not something that we can't be free of. We actually can have that state of being liberated, free, and even going beyond that to achieve enlightenment. All right, now on to the third one, going beyond acceptance to genuine growth and appreciation of the reality of aging. Again, maybe these are fine points within this, and maybe some people will go through all three of these in a very quick time, but this is where you actually say, what are the gifts that aging has to teach me? As I was just saying, we embrace our suffering as a part of our reality. We actually go, oh, well, what can I actually use from that? How can I actually make that a part of my spiritual path? How can I appreciate my aging? I might mention one little, I was touched when I saw this movie when I was much younger, Manhattan by Woody Allen. I know he's not looked upon very favorably in some circles these days because of all the accusations made about him. But there was and of course in this film, he was with a young woman, Muriel Hemingway, I think played the love interest of him in this, and they were watching a movie together. And there was like an older actor with, you know, aged face with, you know, some of the creases and what have you. And they were talking about how beautiful the face was, how an old face actually looks beautiful. But, you know, most people don't have that concept, right? You know, we kind of shy away from things like that remind us of our own mortality, perhaps. But, you know, how do we appreciate aging in a similar way, where we actually look at the beauty of aging, the gifts of aging? This is what we're going to pursue for the rest of today, the little bit of time that we have left. I spent too much time, I think, on some of these other points. But for this, I'm going to draw a little bit from a wonderful book as well. I'm using some of her points, but also adding a few of my own. A book called The Grace of Aging by Kathleen Dowling Singh. She passed away a few years ago. Her first book is called The Grace of Dying. Then she wrote The Grace of Aging, and then she finally wrote a book called The Grace of Living, I think. But was a wonderful, accomplished practitioner. And she feels that there are these sort of, she called them special conditions that we can embrace about aging. And in particular, this might be something that we could relate mostly with old age, but it's not to say that it's excluding anybody at any other age, because you can still have these in your life if you choose to do so. So that's what I want to spend, again, the rest of the time is looking at these sorts of gifts of growing older or these special conditions. Kathleen Dowling Singh, in her book, The Grace in Aging, sets out several special conditions of transformation, which are skillful means by which we can organize our life around our intention. These are some of them. I'll just share these and we can maybe discuss them a little bit to conclude today. Simplicity that arises from withdrawing from life's busyness, narrowing one's activities and letting go of self-imposed external measures of our lives. This is a bit of what I was referring to earlier. You know, how when you're younger and you're involved in a career and raising a family and all these various things, like that becomes the whole picture of who you are, right? You know, and it becomes very complex. I mean, I never had children, so I didn't have to deal with that reality. But, you know, for those of you who were parents and then dealing with schools and of course with the pandemic and everything that happened there, and my gosh, the complexities of life, you know, could become overwhelming, right? As you age, or perhaps as you choose to with your life, you can simplify your life. Buddhism is very much about simplicity, not that it's necessary to simplify your life. Many people have very complex and busy lives. I mean, look at Venerable Robina. She's, been living her life as a monastic for many, many years, and yet lives this incredibly, busy life, going from here to here and going all over the world and teaching and what have you. She's got a lot more energy than I do, and she's like 15 years older than me. So I don't know. But nonetheless, simplicity is also a state of mind, right? And it has to do to some degree with withdrawing from our preoccupation with the world around us in the ways that we've been more habitually involved. Not being so concerned about impressions others have of us, and holding some sort of measure of our lives that is really not that accurate. Our lives are going to be much more meaningful when they're measured by spiritual standards as opposed to external standards of what a successful life looks like. I mean, you go to funerals and you hear people talk about their loved one who's deceased, and oftentimes it's these external measures of whether they've had a good life or not. But a good life is measured by the degree to which we've used it spiritually, meaningfully, with great purpose, right? Humility. Humility isn't that popular either. We're living in a world where, being famous and the pride that comes with that and what have you, having others think of us really well, that's kind of how we live our lives. But there's a real grace in humility. It arises from discerning the futility of superiority and arrogance, as well as the advantages of letting go of the illusion of perfectionism and releasing into ordinariness. I think there's naturally a humility that comes when people are aging. I know my mom's gotten much more humble. Initially, when she had to get a walker, she was just like, I hope I'm able to get rid of this soon. She had this view that this was a temporary thing. Well, she's still using the walker, and she's quite okay with the walker now, right? But you have to humble yourself to what aging has to reveal to you. That we were maybe not quite so capable as we thought we were. We might not be able to engage in all the activities that we were able to when we were younger, and so on. We're humbled by a lot of things. But there's great grace again in humility. The humble person is always looking at others from the vantage point of, what can I learn from you, and how might I benefit you, perhaps in some way, be of service to you. Whereas the prideful person thinks, I have nothing to learn from you, and what can you do for me, right? So we see that we relate to things in our lives much differently when we have humility. Another one is presence and commitment that arise from having recognized some level of urgency and thus seeing the need to shift one's priorities towards awakening. I think what Graciela was saying to some degree as well. Again, when we come to that conclusion that every day is very precious, there's an urgency to some degree to using every day well. And I do encourage people to have kind of bookends to your day in terms of your spiritual practice. Start your day with some sort of a reflection. Lama Zopa Rinpoche has his way of encouraging people to start their day, but something to set a good intention for that day. And you might even begin by just rejoicing that you didn't die that night. And even if you're young, you might think, well, I wouldn't have died last night anyway. I'm in good health. But, young people do die overnight. I hate to tell you, this does happen, right? So rejoice that you have another day in this life and make some positive intentions about living that day. Even if it's just one or two thoughts, like, may I be kinder and more compassionate at work to the people that really, get me, that, annoy me, that really cause me problems. Or just, simple things, whatever. And then at the end of your day, look back at how that day went and how your motivations and intentions guided you throughout that day. Give yourself kudos for what you did that was good, for the ways that you really were able to be from that place of being more compassionate and kind. And then if you weren't, if you had failings through the day, then look at what you might do differently. How might I change that? What sorts of thoughts might help me to remind myself to be kinder and more compassionate? You get up your next day and you make the same sort of determination, live your day out and review the day. Of course, in Tibetan Buddhism, we also encourage people to do some purification practice at the end of their day to make sure they kind of uproot those seeds that they planted that might have been sort of, harmful. Again, this idea of commitment, maybe I'll take it off here in just one moment before we go forward. The idea of commitment too is not just your sort of everyday commitment to a spiritual path, but even your commitment to the longer term goals that you'd like to achieve. In Buddhism, we do talk about goals. We're not completely goal oriented because the path is its own goal in a way, but we do have the idea that we each can achieve, first of all, at least a good rebirth when we get to the end of this life. That's already a very amazing goal to have because most people don't even think about what comes after this life. But if we at least spend our day being meticulous to creating actions that will result in a good rebirth, which are virtuous, wholesome actions, refraining from harming others, helping others in whatever ways we can. How wonderful. Another goal we can have, though, is more lasting, which is the goal of liberation, where we're actually able to be free again from our own cycle of existence and attain nirvana. And that's a goal that many Buddhist practitioners have. But the highest goal, the one that we want to aspire to in this tradition, is enlightenment, where we want to become a Buddha. We're not content with just extricating ourselves from this cycle of existence. We recognize that we're like everybody else, and we would like to have the commitment to their welfare as well as our own. So that's where you generate the mind that we call bodhicitta, the mind that aspires to become a Buddha, to become fully awakened, not just achieving your own nirvana, but achieving a state where you can help others to the greatest degree. So again, that's a deeper commitment that we can perhaps see guiding our lives, encouraging us to use every day as much as we can to generate thoughts and actions that are in line with achieving that goal. The next gift is gratitude and generosity of spirit that arise from appreciating one's blessings and good fortune. And then, of course, wanting to reciprocate. It's not enough just to sit in the privacy of one's home and think how grateful one is for everything that you have in your life. You want to have the generosity of spirit of thinking, and may I give this to others? I like this idea of especially older people in our society being treated as elders. And elder is a wonderful word, right? I think we've lost touch with this word in our everyday thinking about people who are more experienced, who have something that they can offer to others. Elders have great wisdom often, as Nicole was pointing out. Through our lives, we generate more and more wisdom. And when they are at that state of, again, no longer perhaps being involved in the workaday world and what have you, but they have still gifts that they can offer to others. And as older people, we can freely offer those gifts. And there was a wonderful program going on in Santa Fe. They were encouraging, because Santa Fe's gotten to be kind of a mix of things. It's got a lot of families and people that live there that support a lot of what goes on in the city, but then you have a lot of retirees moving there. I guess Florida's a bit similar, right? So you have people who are retired, but they were bringing those retired folks, encouraging them to come into the schools, the public schools, to conduct programs and be with the children, so that they get that kind of interaction of the elders and the youngest part of our population that needs that sort of guidance from people who've been around and who've learned a lot. It's not to say that just those people being with them is going to give them life lessons necessarily, but it's a wonderful way to acknowledge what older people have, the gift that they do have of their experience and their wisdom. And my gosh, people who've lived through things that I haven't lived through, that have some other perspective that they can share. But gratitude, I think Graciela mentioned that as well, having a gratefulness. I actually prefer this word gratefulness that Brother David Stendhal-Rast uses. Being grateful, full of gratitude, living every day, just being so grateful. Sometimes when I think about old age, I think about Ruth Gordon and Harold and Maude. Did you see the movie Harold and Maude? Because she was getting ready to turn 80, turns 80 in the film, and she lived this life of just like gratitude for everything, even for funerals. She would embrace everything, the totality of life. Forgiveness and reconciliation. I mentioned, next Saturday, I'm doing a workshop on forgiveness. Forgiveness is a wonderful thing to embrace as part of our acknowledgement of aging. Of course, in our understanding of death, that we may not have an opportunity to forgive others or to be forgiven by others for the things that we've done that have been harmful to them. It's important to be aware of that and reconciling with others. As it says here, these both arise from seeing the weight of holding on to past resentments and opening to taking responsibility for healing and restoring harmony in our relationships. Now, having said that, I'll talk about this next Saturday as well. It doesn't mean that every relationship that you've been in where you've harmed others or they've harmed you is meant to be restored. Because there are relationships where perhaps people don't change, and it might not be a good idea to put ourselves back into a situation where they will harm us or what have you. So recognize that this isn't sort of a measure of whether we're successful at this or not. We can still even forgive and reconcile within our own hearts. And again, that'll be part of next Saturday that I'll talk about, is how we can engage in forgiveness and reconciling within ourselves, even if we don't necessarily restore the relationship. But it's good to have that harmony from our side. To what degree are we holding on to things? As I said, this doesn't, you don't wait till your old age to say, oh, I've really got to make up with my sister who really pissed me off when I was 21 years old, make up with her now, or try to at least resolve it from your own side now. If she's so difficult that you can't possibly get along with her and you know that it's just going to be, gasoline on fire, well, then stay away, but reconcile in your own heart. Insight, perhaps one of the more important ones. Insight that arises from having embraced solitude and silence and then opening to investigating the true nature of reality of the self. Of course, in Buddhism, this is the deepest sort of investigation we all need to do at some point. Buddhism just isn't about having all this understanding of suffering and what have you. It's really doing the deeper work to remove suffering completely, which is to gain the insight into the nature of reality, the nature of the self, what we frequently call emptiness or voidness, shunyata in Sanskrit. So know that again, there is an opportunity as we begin to see, well, who is aging? Who is this person? What is happening to this person? What will happen to this person as we progress through death and so on? What lies beyond death? These are the deeper issues that perhaps our old age or even our awareness of aging at whatever age we are can prompt us to do, is to really take a deeper look at who is the self? What is the self? Does it exist in the way that it appears? Again, that's a whole nother teaching, something I really can't get into too much. So I want to end with this little prayer for the passing away of things that Louis Richmond has. As everything ages and passes away, may each of us be kind to ourselves. As everything ages and passes away, may each of us accept joy and sorrow. As everything ages and passes away, may each of us be happy and at peace. It's a wonderful little prayer, I think, to kind of encapsulate through what we've done here today, our own awareness of aging and other realities of life. May this be a blessing to us, and may it help us and others on our path. And we can dedicate very strongly with those thoughts. May everything we've done here today have that result. I do want to open it up for some questions, but I realize we're also at 12:30. And so was there maybe one or two questions or comments that anybody needed to make?
Maybe, Zoom. Questions on Zoom.
I didn't see any. No. Let me check the chat box again. Oh, what is the name of the movie of a woman who turns 80 and is thankful, please? Harold and Maude. It's a really, I don't know, it's kind of a dated film now, but it's got humor to it, but it's got a serious side to it as well. And if you haven't seen it, you really should. It was actually one of my films that got me really thinking about aging and death initially as well. Yeah.
So when I was 12.
You saw it when you were 12. Wow. Harold and Maude. Let me write it down. Yeah. Okay. So, any comments from anyone else? Whoops.
This constellation every morning, going for 9 points.
Wonderful.
On the sand glass analogy, so beautiful. But a bit more sand at the bottom today than there was yesterday.
Yeah. What Anthony's talking about is one of the ways that we do a meditation on death. There's one point where you think about how your lifespan's diminishing every single moment. As we've sat in here for an hour and a half together, we've another hour and a half worth of sand grains have come down from the upper chamber into the lower chamber. Of course, we don't know how many sand grains are in the upper chamber, right? We like to think that there's a whole lot of those. And we got, many, many, many more sand grains until we have the end of the life, the last one coming through the end of our life. But it's a very powerful analogy. I like using that one as well. Sometimes I use this idea of a train that's heading on its destination, and every moment, of course, it's getting close to the final point. That one doesn't work so well for me. The hourglass is really pretty effective because you can't put the grains of sand back in the top, right? You want to just like grab a bunch of them and put them back in so that you can extend your life. Now, again, I don't want to make it seem too like definitive as to how long you have, but they do say that when you are born, the karma that kind of creates this life does determine to some extent your lifespan. You can have a life that is shorter than that, but based on all the sort of karmic conditioning that ripened into this human existence, you have a certain lifespan. I'm sorry, was there a comment?
No, I was just thinking.
Yeah,
of the
Julie.
soap opera that,
Days of Our Lives with the big, yeah.
That has
Yeah, that's the hourglass with the sand. Yeah. I sometimes think of the Wizard of Oz with the one that, the witch put up there. That was really quick though. I mean, my gosh, before she knew it, the thing was going off. But So again, whatever analogies work for you, I think they give us the reality of aging as well as the reality of death. That every single moment, sometimes people just pay attention to their breath. Every single inhalation and exhalation, that's one less breath that you have in this life. Can freak you out a little bit, but it's meant to. I mean, we do need sometimes those kind of reminders that, hey, folks, you got to wake up sooner than later. Lightning strikes kind of thing. So, any other comments before we close today? Yeah, Gracian.
Yeah, I was thinking about your mom's statement of leaving the bus and
Yeah.
never gonna be. And I really understand that, empathize with,
Uh-huh.
and for me, it's the experience that at every age we are put into a box.
Mhm.
And many of us buy into that box, which usually have to pay, oh, yes, it's I'm older, and so I'm
Yeah.
supposed to be sick, and and it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And so if that bus was filled of ladies that have bought into the being older
Being
and sicker,
Yeah.
then I agree with it 100%.
Yeah. I think it's a bit of what Matt was saying too, like
Yeah.
different perceptive, we can have a different perception of ourselves while others may see us
Right.
as older people, as senior citizens, as whatever.
And that putting people in boxes is
Yes.
just-
Yeah.
it's really limiting.
Yeah.
It's
I agree.
limiting.
I agree. But we do have the reality of we've got different aged bodies and what have you, but nonetheless, I think, yeah, we can never really tell. And the way people feel inside is very different, perhaps, than what they look from the outside. I think Ruth Gordon in that film, Harold and Maude, was very much an example of that. So there's a benefit, as I was saying to Matt's point, there's a benefit to having a more youthful attitude in spite of what the body's doing. Can keep you feeling a little more, if it's not get so agitated by the pains that happen as you age. I can say that to some degree, because you kind of feel like, oh, well, that's just another, as Jack was saying, it's another part that's kind of going bad. And there's another part that's going to, got the flashing light on that one. So, you just kind of take it a little more casually. I mean, again, not that you don't still see it as indicative of where you're headed and what's going on. You still have to have that awareness. But you don't become so second arrow about it. You don't have to torture yourself with all these additional thoughts. I think we should conclude, because otherwise, we're kind of keeping people way longer beyond. So again, dedicate very strongly for our own enlightenment and enlightenment of all beings. We dedicate also for the good health and long lives of our precious teachers, so we can always be guided by them perfectly. And lastly, we dedicate for all those beings who we're holding in our hearts right now, whatever their suffering might be, may they be benefited from what we've done here today. Find true peace and happiness. May all beings also find complete freedom from suffering and perfect happiness by virtue of all our efforts. Thank you all for joining from home. Thank you all for joining here in the Gompa, and I'll look forward to hopefully seeing you again soon. Okay,
Thank you, Don. Thank you,
you're very
everyone.
welcome. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank
Sister,
you.
doing everything.
Just stand in here.